Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar, Leading Change. Today's webinar will be presented by Lisa Godfrey, Director at NHS Elect, and Piers Young, Director at NHS Elect. First, we have a few simple housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded, so all attendees are muted to avoid background noise during the recording. If you do have a question throughout the presentation, please type your question into the question box. And the presenters will pick them up throughout the presentation. Thank you. And now I'll hand over to you, Piers and Lisa, for your presentation.
Thank you. I just need to go on to clean screen.
Okay.
So welcome everybody. My name is Lisa Godfrey. As Lena said, I'm a director at NHS Elect. We're really delighted to be here today to talk to you a bit about leading and managing change, and just to share some reflections. Just by way of background, I've got a clinical background, and prior to joining NHS Elect, I held a number of director posts, mainly in acute organisations, but also in charities, and broadly around the topic of transformation. So this is the subject that I'm particularly interested in.
Thanks. And I'm Piers Young, also Director at NHS Elect. And again, been alongside Lisa, worked along a number of these change programmes and leading change and going through this with organisations. My background more recently is predominantly around operational management. I've worked at Chief Operating Officer level, but also held a number of service improvement and directors of transformation roles, both locally and then also at the national level as well. So thank you very much. So turn off our cameras whilst we go through this presentation. So I'm going to bid you goodbye from my camera from this point, but we'll obviously be online and audio. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to kick off. Before I go in to the presentation, you'll see that there's a chat box in the menu bar in the toolbar to the right-hand side of your screen. What we'd be really interested in exploring from you and getting some insights is, what are your thoughts about why change fails? So if you could just jot those down as I just go into a bit of an introduction. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation about them shortly. Okay, I'm just going to do firstly a quick introduction to NHS Elect. I know that many of you are probably familiar with us as an organisation, but just by way of a bit of background, we were founded in 2002 by Ara Darzi, initially to support NHS organisations working on elective pathways, but rapidly kind of expanding to cover lots of different service areas and pathways. We're very much part of the NHS, hosted by a West London hospital, and at any one time we work with probably around 70 organisations in our membership. Mainly supporting local teams in leadership development, quality improvement, marketing and branding, and we do a lot of OD work. In addition, we work on and we host several improvement collaboratives, so focusing on urgent and emergency care. Some of you may be familiar with the Ambulatory Emergency Care Network and the Acute Frailty Network. And we think, well, we know we've probably worked with about 200 plus organisations that have participated through these. You can find out more details about our programme on www.nhselect.nhs.uk or our emails. Piers and I, our emails come up later on, and you can email us directly. Okay, so the objectives for today, we're aiming to provide you with an example of a model of change. So we're going to look at Kotter's eight steps process. What I would say is that there are, we'll discuss this, but there are so many. It's a really broad church. There are lots and lots of models of change that can be used and have got really valuable kind of aspects to them. This today is going to focus primarily on Kotter and some of the behavioural aspects of change. However, we can run subsequent sessions on the broader landscape, if that is helpful. So we're going to cover Kotter. We're going to look at some management tools that can help you lead improvement projects locally, and as I say, and do some exploration of understanding the human elements of change, because no matter how good a model, actually without the kind of people aspect, you're unlikely to succeed. So a model for change. So prefacing this with, all models are wrong, but some are useful. We hope that you'll find some useful aspects to this. And what we kind of recommend really is to obviously take a critical eye. So where things resonate, use them and adopt. Where they don't, then obviously don't. So leading change. This really is an innovative approach, but I'm afraid we can't consider it. It's never been done here before. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you. I think it kind of illustrates that change is a continuum. There are peripheral changes that can be accommodated and that people can feel comfortable with, right the way through to a disruptive innovation where actually it just feels too uncomfortable. So it's very much a continuum. Change affects different people in different ways, and some changes that may seem small to others are larger to other people. So understanding that is key. Okay. So hopefully we've got some thoughts in the comments box. So why does change often fail?
Yeah. So Lisa, quite a few come through there. If you wanted to just take it now. So we've got engagements, a lack of engagement, fear of lack of engagement, lack of understanding, resistance, and a lack of resources. There's many more coming in, so I'll pick up those later on. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, fear of change, failure to see the benefits, poor buy-in, and it just kind of illustrates that with a moment or two of thought, you know, we can generate a pretty substantial list. And I guess it's the reason for just talking about that at the beginning is it kind of illustrates that there's not a magic bullet really to change, and we've all been subject to successful and more than likely unsuccessful change processes. And I suppose there's an important aspect in leading change that we take that learning individually, and no matter what model we use, we try and apply what we've learned. Okay, so we're not the first people to reflect on this question. Lots of theories, loads and loads of books, and schools of thought. Yeah, so we're not covering a wealth of that material today, but focusing very much on Kotter. I wanted just to start though with some really I think helpful insight from somebody called Rick Maurer, and this is from No Change Without Migraine, and he talks about a cycle of change, and he talks about actually that there's a process before we even get started around how we move people from kind of a position being in the dark, with a sense that something's not working, but with little clarity, through to kind of seeing the challenge and thinking about, okay, this is a problem, you know, let's kind of try and get our hands around it and identify, you know, what we could potentially do, through to then getting started. So there's that kind of pre-bit, steps 1 and 2, before he describes moving on to roll out results and then time to move on. The reason I show this is because often we focus on getting started. We don't focus on necessarily sufficiently well on the in the dark bit. So building that kind of necessary case for change, communicating why change is happening, and we don't really work through you know, the kind of aim sufficiently well and how we communicate it. That can sometimes manifest in that notion of resistance, and that people are resistant. But Rick Maurer's position is that there's a lot more to resistance than meets the eye. The other point here is that last number 6, you know, time to move on, is that we don't arrive in a place where we've delivered a change and then life stands still. So it's a cyclical process, and that we need to harness and understand. Okay, but just drawing on that, so what Rick Mora says in Change Without Migraine is that it's quoted, the Fortune 500 executives were surveyed, and I think there's a general rule of thumb that's accepted that about 70% of change fails. And the Fortune 500 chief executives say that this is mainly due to resistance rather than technical skills. So just building on that last slide, really, Maura said that actually there's more to it than meets the eye, and we need to really understand why people are resisting it. And actually what may be perceived as resistance may be on one level or another about kind of survival, really, for individuals. So really trying to understand where resistance is coming from is a really kind of important aspect to taking forward successful change. And when you then kind of have that in mind, he says then the other things like, you've got to make a really clear case, as I've already mentioned. There needs to be some really, really strong processes for communication. And also a lot of successful change is predicated on building good relationships and rapport through lots of different channels, but that needs to be kind of reflected and programmed in. None of it can work without leadership, and the tone of the leadership is really critical in terms of supporting all of those associated processes. The other thing that he describes is around sustainability, and we'll do some more on sustainability later on in Kotter. But it's not just the delivery of the change, but how do we nail it, continue it, and continue to improve? I guess it's particularly relevant for us now in the COVID situation, where there's been such rapid change over such a very short period of time. It's, what does the future look like in terms of what are the gains that need to be held? How do we sustain? But also how do we continue to innovate and move on, because it's very much a changing landscape. Okay, so just moving on to Kotter. So this is described as an 8-step process of leading change. What we would say is it's not sequential, although there's a kind of logical sequence that change is a messy business. You'll often have more than one step in operation at any time. This is him. John Kotter is professor at Harvard and studied why change fell for over 4 decades. And he looked at the failures of change programs and then distilled out, actually, there's some key kind of success factors that if they're not present, we're unlikely to deliver what we aim to deliver. Okay, and these are the steps. So there are 3 kind of stages, really. There's the first stage, which is about helping to defrost the status quo, as he describes it. So this is creating a platform and a state of readiness for change. And then he talks about some steps around introducing new practices. So when you begin to make the change, and then embedding new approaches. So just taking those first 4 points, he talks about, and I'll come on to this, but establishing a sense of urgency. How can we create a sense of momentum and the need for change to happen, and to happen now? And clearly, this current situation is, we've got an example of that we'll take a look at in a minute. Pulling together a guiding team. So who's going to lead the change, drive the change, and an exploration of that. Creating the change vision and strategy. So whilst you may have a sense of an urgency around a particular issue, and you may have leadership and you may have staff engaged, actually they need a clarity about the direction of travel and the strategy to get there. Communication for understanding and buy-in. So how are we going to communicate what it is that we're doing? What do we want people to know? But also, what do we want people to feel, and what do we want people to do as a consequence? And then, that hopefully lays a really good kind of foundation for taking change forward. And Kotter describes the introduction of new practices here. So if you want to deliver on scale, there needs to be that sort of distributed leadership process to empower others to act, planning for quick wins, and consolidating improvements are all part of the kind of action stage. And then that section, that kind of eighth step rather, which is about sustainability. So ground the change in the culture and helps make it stick. but recognising that this will be cyclical, as Maura describes. Okay, I'm just going to focus now in a little bit more detail on the steps. This is so this first step around creating a sense of urgency. And Kotter sees this as positive urgency, so driven by a real need with real benefit. So, and he says it's about helping others to see the need for change and the importance of acting quickly. And so there are two aspects. It's helping the organisation to see why this change needs to happen and why does it need to happen now. And what he kind of describes is that we're over here are the teams in the status quo, as it were, and that there's a job to be done, which is to gain their buy-in, because the change that's required, they may not they may not have bought into it, they may be in the dark, etc. So there's a piece of work to do there, and so it's that helping teams to see. And there are two aspects to this. The first is that kind of burning platform. What will happen if we stay here? What's going wrong, and what are the threats? And we clearly have had a real sense of that with the COVID environment. So the threats have been significant, and there's been absolute clarity about the need for change. But there's also this other aspect, which is how do you help teams to see the benefits of new ways of working? Why would they want to go there? So if it's completely threats-based, it can have quite a negative and toxic impact in an organisation. So the benefits need to be really clear. I mean, it's quite interesting at the moment with the massive services shifts that we're witnessing. And just, I mean, it's a small detail really, but this shift to video clinics and consultations, and after many years of trying to get those in, we now see that they've happened in a number of days or weeks. And in fact, my son, who has epilepsy and is a very reluctant hospital attendant, it's very difficult to get him to go, had his first consultation in our living room with a paediatrician, and she described how they never wanted to go back, actually. That patients and families were really supportive. So there are two sides to this coin. So it's thinking about, if you want to create that sense of urgency, what can you do to generate that notion of burning platform, and how can you help teams see the positive benefits of a change? I just wanted to share another example, and this is how a London teaching hospital that I worked at created a sense of urgency around a particular issue. So pain, they did particularly badly on their, or they struggled anyway on their inpatient survey results in relation to the pain questions. And so lots of patients were reporting that their pain wasn't well managed, and a kind of conventional response would perhaps have been, there would have been an action plan generated to improve patient experience. It's sat somewhere. There may have been monitoring through various patient experience and quality steering groups, may have added in some additional KPIs in year, and then often you just wait for those next round of surveys to see if you're if you've done better. Hopefully iPads on wards and so on. So there is some continuous quality improvement, but that would largely often characterise the approach. In this organisation, what happened as an exec team was that we agreed that we needed to create a sense of urgency and of positive urgency, that this was an issue that as an organisation we really wanted to do something about. We wanted a high profile and inclusive approach. So we wanted this kind of call to act that empowered the staff members to participate. It's a large organisation, 6 sites, and we had a genuine kind of vision to improve. So there was this decision taken to survey every patient in every single bed across the 6 sites. So a call went out to non-clinical volunteer surveyors, and that was a part of the approach around being inclusive, was giving back office staff an opportunity to get involved. And these emerged as a kind of core team, a kind of guiding team to take forward and coordinate the work. Lots and lots of communications. And then we did things like staff surveys and patient stories. So that was the approach. And then when the results, we had them after the day of the survey, we had them on the intranet within 48 hours. And we spoke to 381 patients using 50 surveyors. We had a 94% response rate. 50%, half the patients were in pain, and the pain, was kind of reasonably severe. There was also loneliness was identified as a major issue. And so this kind of, the reason I've shown this, it kind of gives a sense of those Kotter steps, both urgency and the other ones that I've talked about very briefly around the importance of communications and so on, about how we managed to mobilise in a way that a conventional approach through steering boards, etc., wouldn't have perhaps achieved. So people loved participating, and we had some themes that you probably could have written independently without doing any of that, but the fact was there was now this kind of a bit of a social movement generated around it. Okay, so step 2, so creating that guiding team or coalition. So this is about putting together a group with enough power to lead the change, and these are not necessarily people who sit within conventional hierarchy. They may well be, but we're also interested in who the opinion leaders are, who's credible, who has authority to influence and to get stuff done and really get behind and drive the change. And we often find that we don't perhaps do this sufficiently well. We might go through a kind of maybe a standard, kind of program board setup, which is absolutely, has got a very important function to play. But those real advocates of driving change, this might be a slightly different kind of makeup. And so then, if you're going to start thinking about who's on your side and who do you need to get involved, the kind of mapping process of stakeholders is quite an important step in with this stage. And many of you may have seen these two sort of simple axes where you plot your stakeholders, a level of interest along one axis at the bottom, and then at the side, a level of power and influence. And then you look at your kind of, your stakeholders, and you think about where do they sit in relation to those axes. And you have kind of 4 quadrants. Here's an example. This is from a surgical AEC project, but this is how it would characteristically look, where you've got your finance director up there in the top left column, quadrant rather. You've got an ED lead clinician, you've got a general manager, medical director just is showing a higher level of interest, clearly very influential, and often you'll find patients sit in that lower level of influence and power, but actually really, really interested. And I mean, the purpose for showing this is, when we write our maybe program initiation documents, we'll list our stakeholders. We don't necessarily, or we may well have a communications plan against them, but we don't necessarily think about where are they on the stakeholder map and where do we want to get them, where do we want them to be, and what action do we need to take to move them around. So, for example, you may want your FD to be really, really interested, and so you might need to have that conversation about how do you get them more interested, what kind of information would be useful for them. Conversely, you may have people who are influential and very interested that you perhaps prefer to be less interested, so you may think about how can I keep them informed so that they're not kind of constantly wanting an information feed from me. So this enables a kind of strategy around communication to be developed. And there are sort of some actions really that one would take, and those individuals or teams with kind of a lower level of power and interest, there is something about just monitoring them and thinking about, is there more information we need to give them, and so on. And then the higher the level of interest, so moving along to the right, then there's that necessity to keep people informed, and consultations, so formal kind of consultation will fit within that. And then you've got those that are, you know, the influential folk that you need, you know, kind of really to keep satisfied and involve them as far as possible, with your key players kind of managing very, very closely, because you want them to be your real advocates. And when we process map, when we do stakeholder mapping, it's good to plot both kind of teams or got staff groups, but also individuals. So the smaller the project, the more important key individuals are, because, you know, you may have a nurse leader who's, you know, really, really on board and another who isn't. So you might need to strategize on an individual basis. The final thing I just wanted to say about the, you know, that kind of creating that guiding coalition, or who's in your core team, is just something about these two lists. This is a slide adapted by Helen Bevan, and she describes these two lists. So list A are the kind of conventional leaders that are really crucial to a change process. So our sponsors, the transformation board, the PMO, clinical leads, directors, etc., the people that you would all list. And what Helen talks about is actually, to really drive change, we also need to harness the energy and efforts of some of these folk in list B. So, you know, and that might be a bit of an uncomfortable process. We might have, you know, people who are perceived as mavericks, people who, the kind of contrarians who will do things their way, not perhaps the way that is perceived to be on message, but they absolutely get things done. The non-conformists, so the people who see the world through slightly different lenses, and this can be really important around ideas generation and new thinking. And then what are described as the hyper-connected and hyper-trusted. So the people who have got really good connections and networks, how do we absolutely maximise those? And, you know, for whatever reason, who are the people that other people trust that may be really good advocates? So in that sort of process, that's step 2 of building your, you know, guiding team and your stakeholder mapping. It's just thinking about it in the broadest sense, really. And then I just wanted to share this quote, really, that quoted by Al Gore, an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And it's that principle that actually it can take a bit longer to get things going, and it's much faster to get something done, do it yourself. However, that sort of taking that time to align people, to clarify, you know, to create that sense of urgency and clarify what it is that you're doing, is a really important task. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for any questions. Any questions or comments at this stage?
So Lisa, we've got, just to continue from the question you asked at the beginning about, you know, why does change? We've got a lot more comments, some common themes coming through, which you've covered to some degree and we'll cover later on. So the lack of leadership from the top, or the senior leaders not being committed. So I think that concept of doing the stakeholder mapping to really understand where people are, and perhaps senior leaders, is important. And I know you're going to talk more about sustainability and how that's covered there as well. The traditional sort of feedback that people are getting, or resistance, again, going back to that point, we've always done it this way, so why do we need to change? So I think your example of your own situation with your son and the change to video consultations and discussing that, you know, we've been talking about this for a number of years in the NHS. But we've finally seen it happen at pace for particular circumstances. So, you know, you could kind of look at that and say there's going to be almost no excuse as to we've always done it this way. We've proved that we can change and we can adapt when we need to. Other bits that come into is lack of benefits, or understanding what that vision, what is the aim of the change you're trying to do. So we'll cover that shortly in a minute. And generally a lack of resources. So that's not just, but it's also and funding, but support. So some teams are feeding back that they feel they're unsupported or there isn't perhaps the change management or the management structure to support those changes going along. And we're getting a few more comments coming through in terms of burnout of change, and I think there's a danger of that perhaps sort of right now. There always has been a history of that, I think, in the NHS, but certainly that change for change's sake, feeling that perhaps people have had up until now. So they're the main themes that have been coming through following that question, and I think I've managed to pick up a few of the others as well.
That's great. And actually, that last question around that last comment around burnout is so, it's so important moving forward, because looking after our staff, supporting kind of resilience and well-being, and it's going to be a really important aspect of any kind of programme of work moving forward, and which I hope is considered and not kind of which I'm sure it will be, but it's going to be really important. Okay.
Yeah, one of the questions has been about how do we deal with that, or for those that are affected. And I think some of it is, if you look at certainly the stuff that's coming out very related to COVID-19, for example, the Royal College of Surgeons guidance and NHS improvements guidance about restarting services, there's a real emphasis on making sure that staff aren't fatigued. Not just doing the work, but constantly having to change services to adapt to the current situation. So I think some of that leads to your management style and making sure that that's well considered within your programs and plans, I think, is probably everything else that you think would be useful for people to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And on some of the human aspects of change that we'll come on to right at the end, it's about how you support new beginning, and which we'll touch on with somebody called Bridges. So are you happy now to move on, Piers? Shall I hand over to you? So I will continue to move the slides for you.
Yeah, thank you. So the next step around Kotter is developing the change vision, or a change vision. And this relates, obviously, as we talked about, some of the comments coming through is how do you articulate the benefits? How do you get people engaged with what you're trying to do? And it's very much about ensuring that it's not only sort of clear in what you're trying to do, but looking at how you can make it imaginable, feasible and desirable. So really trying to engage people, get them involved. It's very relevant to the current context. And I think the next few slides and steps of Kotter that we're going to go through, emphasis is very much on people make decisions based on their emotions rather than their rationale or rational behaviour. So really important to think how you can tap into people's emotions. Okay, next slide, please. So step 4 is about communicating that vision and buy-in. And there's a number of different ways you can see from here that typically any organisation or team tend to do this. And the NHS is not alone. I'm sure most of you or your chief executives have blogs that they do, or key people such as medical directors, where they send out either on a weekly or monthly basis their thoughts of what they found. Communicating perhaps also plans for the future. You have one-to-ones with teams and an array of social media websites and ways of digitally being able to communicate your visions to people and to try and gain that buy-in. So we'll try and explore that a bit more about how you can do that in a bit more detail. And as I said in the previous slides, in a more feasible and imaginative way. Okay, next slide, please. So to start with, it's about getting that vision, clear roadmap to where you want to go. And sometimes when we do this, we start with a little picture of a muddled path or a maze path. And the way that is always the easiest to route doesn't necessarily lead you to sustainable change and leading that change. But the more complicated one with a number of barriers is the one, unfortunately, you tend to go through. So it's important that you try to spend as much time as you can to clarify what that vision is and to really articulate the roadmap. Some of you have probably done exercises where you try to create what's your vision statement. Could you sum it up? what you're trying to change into one sentence, and really sort of make quite clear to colleagues if you were ever asked, that classic example of being in the lift with your chief executive and having to articulate there and then what you're working on, what are the benefits. Could you do that? And to be mindful of making sure that those statements or sentences are very clear. Next slide, please. So how do you gain that interest? Well, a lot of it is around, as I talked about, improving the engagement. And by improving the engagement, you'll build momentum with your change. And again, it's coming back to the principles of trying to make it simple, straightforward. So your objectives are clear as to what you're trying to do. Repeatable, vivid, and inviting. So really trying to sort of hammer those points across to people. And we've got some examples later on, certainly now, in the current context as to where we've seen that pretty much covered quite well by the government in some circumstances. But you wouldn't necessarily sort of relate them to being inviting with some of their key messages, but they've been fairly straightforward and simplistic in terms of their messages. It's been repeated a number of times, and it's been quite vivid in terms of what they're trying to get you to buy in to what we're trying to do as a country or as an NHS, perhaps. Okay, next slide, please. So just to reiterate what we're kind of covering across, and one of the key principles of trying to communicate to people your vision and your change program: connect to their emotions, not rationale. People make decisions. We do it every day in our lives, in our personal lives as well as work, based on our emotions. Especially now and in this current climate, emotions are quite high, both in the personal circumstances and at work. And so some of the decisions will be made very much based on that. So it's really important to consider. Thank you. Next slide. We're going to explore a bit more about Daniel Pink. Some of you may have come across him. He's an American author with a background in politics and government. And he's written a number of books, which are very popular and have won a number of awards. And one of these is to sell is human. His view is everyone is in sales, whether we believe it or understand that or not. And as leaders within the NHS and trying to embed change or create improvements within systems or services, we are in the business of trying to sell our change or our improvement to colleagues. And that way is about improving your engagement. So it's really important to consider whether it feels alien or not quite right, because we are in public sector health services. That's Daniel Pink's point, is everyone is in the role of trying to sell their idea. And we've got some great examples. So next slide, please. So we're going to attempt to show you a short video which articulates it probably certainly far better than I will. So I'm going to hand over to Lena, who's supporting us today, who's going to provide us with the first video. We've got a couple of them for today. Elevators or Pitches by Dan Pink.
One of my favorite things to write was the pitch chapter, because I'm a writer and I find myself pitching all the time, and I wanted to learn how to do it better. I identified 6 new pitches for the 21st century. So the Pixar pitch is modeled on the narrative structure of Pixar films, and a story artist for Pixar named Emma Coates essentially revealed the source code of this. Once upon a time, every day, one day, because of that, until finally, blank. Just fill in those blanks, and it ends up being powerful. We don't see the world only as a set of logical propositions. We see it as a set of episodes. And by enlisting the power of story in a pitch, which is something we don't do that much, it ends up being a very, very effective way to get your message across. Email is a pitch. Get over it. An email is a pitch. It's a plea for attention. It's a plea to engage. The effective email subject lines fall into 2 categories. They have to be either the category of utility, they're very useful to people, or curiosity. They pique people's curiosity. Anything in between, anything that combines the two, doesn't work very well. Obama did this very well in the campaign. He sent out a lot of emails, but the most popular email, the subject line was, "Hey." Whoa. Think about how many times you open an email that doesn't have a subject line. Some people end up opening those first. Wow, because they're curious. One of my favorites is the rhyming pitch. Seems kind of cheesy, if not sleazy, which rhymes. Rhymes end up increasing what's called processing fluency. And when people are able to process something more fluently, they absorb it more, they understand it better. There was a trial of O.J. Simpson, the former football star, who was accused of murdering his wife and her friend. They found a glove on the crime scene. And so the prosecutor said, well, of course it's your glove, try it on, and he can't get the glove on his hand. In the closing statement, the late Johnny Cochran said to the jury, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. What's remarkable now is that 18 years later, people remember that. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Questions are active, statements are somewhat passive. So if I just make an assertion to you, you listen, okay, cool, you're listening. But if I ask you a question, you inevitably have to respond. A great example of this is Ronald Reagan in 1980, where the economy was in the tank, and he could have said, your economic condition has deteriorated over the last 48 months. Instead, he said, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And that's more persuasive, that's more likely to move people, because what happens? They think, am I better off? They start thinking about it, and they begin to articulate their own reasons for agreeing with you. So don't you think we should all use more question pitches? Tweeting is a form of pitching, and there's some evidence showing that the most important thing you can do in pitching via Twitter is give people good information. Even if it's self-promotional, people tend to dig it, and also questions. All right, questions via Twitter end up being really effective too. One of them is the one-word pitch. The idea in the world right now is you want ownership of one word. So when people think of you, they think of that word. When people say that word, they think of you. And actually, it turns out that President Obama did a pretty good job of this, because his word in 2012 was forward. All of the ads, all the public events had that word, forward. And so he was able to distill his message into one word. The pitch process, when it works well, is inherently collaborative. In some ways, pitch isn't quite the same word, because pitch implies I'm going to throw this to you and you're either going to catch it or not. It's much more interactive. We have to think of pitching not as saying I'm going to sell you on this right now, but essentially here's an invitation, an intriguing invitation to have a conversation.
To Sell is Human is about how to move people with authenticity, with passion, and with
Okay, Lena.
purpose.
So that's
One
the
day,
end
I
of
went
the
back
video.
and looked at my
Okay, thanks for that. So that works well, which was great. So next slide, please, Lisa. In terms of what Dan covered, he talked about his 6 types of pitches that you can find across. And the reason for covering this is these may be things that you want to consider, a combination of them, if not all, with trying to articulate and communicate your vision for change as leaders within the NHS or your organisation. And there's a number of different challenges with using them, I think, but there's some real benefits. It goes back to what we talked about, being imaginative and trying to grab the attention of people. And as Daniel Pink sort of ended on that short video, it's about the collaborative way of bringing in people, sowing the seed of thought in people's minds, and maybe looking at the long-term engagement with people as you go forward. But a number of things that you need to be aware of is, before you sort of embark on that, is what do you want them to know about what you're trying to do? What do you want them to feel? So again, remember that people make their decisions on emotions rather than rationale. What do you want them to do? Is there anything in particular you want them to sort of come into? And as Daniel Pink ended at the end, it's less about throwing a ball for you to catch, more about intriguing an invitation to have a conversation. So how do you engage with people to understand? Because you may not have all the answers, you may not have all of the solutions to the problems you're trying to solve. So engaging people early on to be able to bring them in is a great way to sort of build your momentum for your change management programs. Okay, next slide, please. So you talked about the one word, and there's a number of examples in there. For example, you think about technology companies. What's the one word that everyone uses, or search engine that everyone uses when they think of search? You know, Google has built a huge empire on being able to get people to understand in just one word what they do. People refer to it, just Google it rather than search for it. And no other competitor is really rivaling them at this time. What credit card companies think of when you hear priceless? Well, there was a big campaign by MasterCard, and their main thing was priceless. So every single ad campaign, every single sort of support or program that they provided, they basically said at the end, the tagline was priceless. And in the example that Daniel Pink gave, it's about Obama. And in his election campaign, in the run-up to becoming president of the USA, the one word he kept using was forward. So every statement that he made, every policy promise that he made, it was about moving forward. So it's really sort of understanding, is there a particular word that you could use that articulates what you're trying to do in a very simplistic way, that again grabs people's attentions, but also perhaps subconsciously is embedded in them to really make them think about being engaged. Again, going back to that sort of conversation. Next slide, please. Here's a couple of, well, one main example, I suppose you could say, relevant from today. Just interesting watching the government in terms of how they've engaged every day with people, but more importantly, I suppose you could say the pitches. So even in the government and in a crisis such as COVID-19, they are trying to engage with people. They're trying to communicate their aims of the programme across to us as the general public. So we've seen some really clear, vivid and repeatable, in particular, I think is one of the key bits. I don't think that a day goes by without them repeating, someone either on the news or through the conferences repeating the statements that they want. And they're really trying to get across in a very simplistic way, from the messages anyway, what they're wanting people to do. I think they got slightly more complex and probably vague perhaps when they were asked to share some of the details. So, but generally about the messages or the pitches that they've been giving, it's quite strongly related to what Daniel Pink was saying. Okay, next slide, please. The question pitch, I think this is quite a difficult one to do, but the example there was around Ronald Reagan turning a situation around to ask a question. You could argue that's a typical politician's way of dealing with the problem, but perhaps posing a question about to staff, certainly relating to some of the points that were raised earlier about why change fails, you know, and maybe putting it back, saying, you know, are you better off than you were before, or what do you want to see from this patient care? Something simple like that, really to engage with people. Again, it's opening up a conversation to have about how you might maybe be able to move things forward. And some of the comments at the beginning about why change failed is because workforce weren't consulted or haven't been involved, or they're top down. So a question pitch is a good way to engage with people. You're not offering them the solution in that pitch, but you are inviting them to engage with you and to then talk about what it is that they could have an impact on, or you're trying to do with your change or improvement program. Next slide, please. So this was the rhyming pitch, and some of you have probably seen the remakes of this on Netflix in terms of the trial. They're very famous. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. The O.J. Simpson trial. It's a really probably similar to a number of the other pitches, and I've said it. It can be quite tricky, but this is a really good way to sort of engage with people. And if I can have the next slide, you'll see examples of that we found from across the NHS. And there's some really good ones that engage with people, pick up, but also they're articulating quite clearly what they're trying to do within the programme. Red to green gets you seen. No joke if you choke, in terms of the speech and language therapy. You know, their programme was around swallow assessment training. And space on the plate is great. Again, dietitians working to make sure that patients with dementia are not overwhelmed. So not only get a bit of fun and it's imaginative, but it's also simplistic in terms of what they're trying to articulate as the aim of their improvement program. So although it can be difficult initially, I think people conceive it to be. I challenge you guys to have a think about, if you're working on something particular, could you come up with a rhyming pitch for it? And I think you'd be surprised that although initially it might find difficult, give yourself a couple of minutes and you'll probably start to pull things together. So certainly, again, if you're working on something at this moment in time, we'd love to hear any pitches you might have or rhyming pitches that you might have about that program. So feel free to type them into the question box that you have done before. One that is not on here, which is more relevant now than perhaps before, is we were doing some work up at Sherwood Hospitals, Sherwood Forest Hospital, and they were leading on a transforming outpatient program looking at virtual consultations. How familiar is that? The one they came up was on the phone or at home, and obviously the aim being outpatient services directly to patients whilst they're at home. So very relevant now, but this was something that they were working on before COVID. So have a think about that in terms of what you might be able to do to grab that sort of attention. Okay, the next slide, please. Subject line, again, I think this is quite difficult. We all get hundreds of emails a day. So this is really about how do you make yours stand out? How can you really grab people's attentions? It's a very common way of communicating across organisations and in the NHS. But how can you make your programme stand out amongst all others? And how can you make your email stand out? So really think about simplicity, but imaginative subject lines. Keep them clean. But the example that, again, Dan Pink talks about is with Obama. And he sent an email to people in the run-up to his campaigns or as part of his campaign with just a simple subject line as, hey. And that really sort of engaged him. Now, I think, to be honest, or if we're all honest, if we got an email with the address that looks like it came from Obama, I think we'd all read it just to understand. But one of the interesting bits that we did come up with, anecdotes that we came across when we do this course is, how many times have you received an email and then someone's very quickly recalled that email? What do you normally do? Do you normally just let it go, or are you intrigued? And most of the time, I think we find ourselves trying to read, what is it that you've recalled? Why don't you want us to see that email? So I'm not advocating that as a way to make sure that you grab people's attentions, but you can kind of see the power of something like a subject line in terms of articulating not only what is your change and improvement program, but also engaging with people as well. Next slide, please. Twitter pitch. This is 140 characters, the challenge of how can you get across what you're trying to achieve. And this is just an example from the Tippy College of Business, where they really actually made an incentive or gave an incentive to this. There's been a number of other examples across various different industries where they've set the public a challenge via Twitter. And again, that's another way of engaging with people, posing them through Twitter. I've actually done, when I was in a sort of director of operations role, we were embarking on a recovery program for our elective care. And we held a Twitter conversation with the public and the local councillors and others and staff as well about what we were trying to do. So it started with a pitch via Twitter and an invite to come and talk to us, but then it also became the means that we had a conversation. So maybe think of it in that way, not just the single pitch, but perhaps also thinking, how can you engage directly, both with staff and patients, because it was patients as well coming in saying, what mattered to them. It can be a challenge, as I said, with 140 characters, but it's a good way to communicate with people and engaging, as I said. Okay, next slide, please. There's Pixar pitch. I think this one was really, again, very, very eye-catching in terms of how it's done. But the basis is there's a really set template to getting this across. So is there a way that you can structure what your message is if you're having to give perhaps a presentation to the board about your improvement program, something slightly longer than that traditional scenario of the lift conversation with the senior executive? What could you put together to capture the imagination, but again, going back to the principles of what we're trying to do with these pitches, simplify and clarify your objectives of what you're trying to do, and ensure that you can get across the benefits to people, as well as what you're wanting to engage them on. So a really good example there, and the next slide just goes into a bit more detail on that. I won't read it out for you, but unfortunately this is a bit of a spoiler if you've never seen Finding Nemo, but this is just an example of how Pixar used that to pitch the movie Finding Nemo, which obviously was, for those of you who don't know, was hugely successful for them, but it came from, again, that very basic template that they put together. So you can imagine the world of film. I can only imagine the world of filmmaking, the amount of pitches that they do get. So it's seen as a structure to really clarify it and engage with people across the patch. So a really different way of thinking. Okay, thanks, Lisa. Next slide. So nowadays we're seeing a lot more through social media, and both NHS organisations have their own Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts, and so forth. And what we're seeing is a high number of sort of posts and pages, and the stat there is 87% of Facebook interactions are done through photos. So rather than the written word, what visual depictions or sort of creations can you have? And again, using social media to engage with staff and the public that articulates what you're trying to do. Next slide, please. Another example of this is infographics, to be more engaging than documents, and a lot of acute providers nowadays, and also commissioners, use them to articulate their quality accounts papers, for example, or end of year reports about how they've done. So rather than wading through a 200-page document, it's a really simplistic way to articulate what you're trying to do. Again, it's delivering simple objectives across to the reader, it's engaging them, it's also trying to be imaginative as well. So think about how maybe you can use this, and some organisations have got platforms already built in, so it may be worth asking perhaps your communications team, if you've got one, what do they use, and what can you pinch with pride to perhaps use for your change programs that you're working on. Next slide. The other is just simply to summarize that, again, going back to how people make their decisions, it's based on emotions rather than rationale. Very simplistic posters have images have a higher chance of engaging with people and sort of increasing their sort of engagement than a simple PowerPoint presentation or a document. I think for now, certainly we're seeing that across the country. You only have to go for your daily exercise and your walks around the local areas, and you're seeing lots of rainbows in windows, or now the theme is walk on the roads and the pavements, really depicting the country's thanks and importance of the NHS. So it's really, again, another visual way of seeing how things are coming across. And then the next slide. So there are some platforms that are available. They are free to use to start with. They're a bit like powwow, telephone conference calls. You can have them for a period of time for free, and then they ask you to sort of upgrade. But Bytable and Movely to make short videos. So this moving on your visual representations and your pictures from just pictures and words to putting them into videos again to sort of grab the attention and engage with people, but also it's a good way to concisely articulate what you're trying to improve on. So the next slide. So I think again we've got a short Bytable clip that we want to share with you. So I'm going to ask Lena if she can bring up the next video that we have. So we just need to move out of this screen while she does that. this is very much an example from an NHS organisation that we've been working on, and I'll comment on it once we've seen the video. Okay, thank you, Lena. So that was just a short video from one of our member sites that was working on a discharge and improvement flow program, and really engaged. And you may have noticed within that video clip that they've actually combined a number of those 6 pictures that they'd picked up from Daniel Pink's work. They had the rhymes within there, the short statements, as well as incorporating the whole storyline was based on that Pixar pitch template. So it proves it can be done. And I've even been in a workshop with a group of neurosurgeons, and over the lunch break, they saw that as the challenge. So we did this session with them going through change and talking about Daniel Pink in the morning, and then over the lunch break, they were sitting around the table, and they were working on a particular program, and they managed to pull something together based on that. A bit rough and ready, but really just proves how quickly you can do these things. And again, it's really imaginative, and it's a good way to sort of get this across to people. Okay, next slide, please. So really sort of just to sum up the bits that we've been talking about in these steps, again, reiterating that key message that people make decisions and connect on their emotions rather than rational. So as a senior leader or a leader within organisations trying to improve services, think of how you can tap into those emotions. We've seen a number of examples of not only articulating and the importance of articulating clearly your vision, what are you trying to achieve, the objectives, and picking up those comments we saw earlier at the very beginning as to why change fails. Some of that is because benefits and objectives aren't clear enough. So really make sure that you do that and you cover it, but also think imaginatively. So there are a number of different methods out of those 6 pitches, and don't be afraid to have a go at it. And I think really just to end on it, you know, another way is sort of looking at it again is, what are you more motivated by? Is it a powerful anecdote from a respected leader, or a business case and a PowerPoint presentation? You know, how are you going to change people or do something different to really capture their imagination? And if I think of things that are happening now, which are you more inspired about? Is it the daily conferences with the Prime Minister and colleagues and Secretary of States? Or is it the fact that you've seen something around Captain Tom Moore and what he's been doing in terms of how you're going to support the NHS, or how the public want to support the NHS? So think about how you can really capture it, and think about the different ways in the pitches that we've gone through. Okay, thanks, Lisa. So I think the next one, we're just going to pause to sort of...
Should we pause for questions?
Yeah, just
okay.
There's a couple of comments that I just wanted to sort of probably pick up here at this bit. So, okay. Which really just to sort of come on to that. So again, talking about how do we overcome resistance. We're going to pick that up shortly. The different paces that people will work with. Again, we're going to come up in a minute. But one of the big bits is, how do we get the leaders and senior leaders on board with what we're trying to do? So as I reiterated earlier, or said earlier, some of that is, again, thinking about a different way of approaching it. Lisa outlined the stakeholder mapping, which is really important and really useful to do. And that's a good way of understanding where you think your senior leaders are. And the example that Lisa gave as finance director was quite high up, but not very interested in what was going on, but highly influential. So then think about how you're going to communicate your vision to those individuals to really get across in a clear and concise message. That would be our advice to you, really, is just to look at a combination of that, understanding where they are perhaps in your stakeholder mapping, but then also to think about what type of pitch would be suitable for them. It might be the email, and so therefore you want to think about what's my subject line to really engage with them. Okay, thanks Lisa. Next slide. So this step 5 is about empowering others, and we're going to explore a bit more of that when we and Lisa talked earlier about resistance and the cycles that people go through this, and some of the ways of turning resistance into support is about empowering others within your team. So some of you might have teams that you're working with, and you've got a particular program of improvement that you've been tasked with. So look within your team to who maybe you can empower to make those changes. But it doesn't also have to be within your team. It could be within the services that you're supporting to improve. So encourage them to think of different ways of doing things, non-traditional ideas, but also to really go out and have a go. Give them that sort of headspace or permission to go and do that. So as a leader within your organisation, you're giving them permission to go and try things and try to do different bits. So really look at how you can empower people, because by doing that, you get better buy-in. Again, going back to some of the points that people have raised around the lack of consultation with workforces, this is a really good way of you being able to give them and empower them an autonomy to make some of those decisions to really move forward with their change programs. Okay, next slide, please. And then I suppose following on from that is planning and creating short-term wins as step 6. So this is very much strongly related to as the NHS model of improvement, the Plan, Do, Study Act, methodology of way of doing things. It's about small steps, it's about short-term wins, it's about getting on with small changes that build momentum. The marginal gains is a common analogy around it, and that was certainly used by, for example, organisations like the British Cycling Association, who in the run-up to a series of Olympics looked at how they could change and make short-term wins and create short-term changes to really give them marginal gains overall to bigger successes. So think about how you can motivate teams by those creating short-term wins, and also linking it back to that step 5 about they may be those areas that you can give them the autonomy to make those changes and push forward with it. Okay, next slide, please. So I think this is the last bit for me. So step 7 is just again around not letting up. So moving forward with the momentum that you've gained through the previous steps. Really consolidating those gains to produce more changes, but also going back to referencing people. Don't be afraid to bring them back to your sense of urgency. So why are you trying to do this? What are the main aims? What situation? Why do we need to change and improve our services? And then also looking at celebrating success. There's some of the key points I would pick out from this step is, again, motivating staff to move forward with you, even when it's hard. And I think as leaders within the organisation and the NHS, it's our responsibility to keep motivating staff, even when things are hard, especially now. So try to look at how you can create that energy and motivate people, because that's one of the key ways that you'll be able to sustain change going forward. And part of that is, as I said, trying to look at how you can celebrate success and consolidate these gains to change more. Okay, next slide, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, any questions?
I just wanted to flag up, we've had some really thoughtful comments actually. There's one comment which was about balancing balancing the emotional side versus objectivity and the challenges that holds about doing both, you know, both of those. And then is it important to focus on the what's in it for me question? The criticality of appealing to people's emotions in this current, you know, at this current time, and the importance of that, and having to cater for the hares and the tortoises. You know, so some thought, reflections and questions, really.
Yeah, going back to one of the points, is it important to focus on what's in it for me? Yes, very much so, and that's one of the key things with communicating your vision, is how do you get across what is in it for not only yourself but also individuals, and being upfront and honest about that as well. Vitally important, because that's one of the key ways that you'll get people engaged and overcome resistance. Some of it, going back to how do you turn resistance into sport, some of it is really to clarify, not necessarily at the initial meeting or point of contact and engagement, but going to people as to explain sharing of information as to what are the benefits, and therefore that relates very much to what's in it for me, and answering that question not for yourself but also for others within the team.
Okay. Yeah, I'll move us on.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to finish off on this 8th step from Kotter, and then we're going to turn just for the last 10 minutes or so to look at some of the human aspects of change that we've already talked about. So step 8 is really the importance of communication is really emphasised here. The communicating the improvements that are made, the benefits that have been achieved, where we were and where we are now. And the reason for this is that embedding new approaches, this kind of step where you've reached implementation, can unravel and can be undermined. So the continuation of good communications and aligned communications is a really important kind of feature of embedding the new approach. And then there are the things that we'll be very familiar with around then cementing change within a wider support system and putting it in the infrastructure. So key things obviously like policies and procedures, making sure JDs are aligned, workforce planning is aligned, that there's appropriate training and development for staff, so that again we're taking staff with us and we're moving forward together, and the importance of monitoring and evaluation. And then the kind of hope, the desire, is that the vision becomes, that vision that Piers has talked about a lot, that we talked about right at the beginning as well, becomes a reality. So we deliver, and there's an absolute alignment with values and behaviours, and there's ongoing kind of aligned communications. And at this point, Kotter says that this is where the systems, processes, people and environment are in place to support the reality of sustaining the desired change vision. So that's when all of the ingredients are in the pot and kind of aligned and kind of nailed down and anchored to become the new reality, while still reflecting actually that it's cyclical and there'll be new changes to make. Now I'm just going to focus a little bit more on this question of sustainability, and some of you may have come across the NHS sustainability tool. Is quite old now, 2006, designed by the Modernisation Agency, and it taught, there was a process of engaging with hundreds of NHS staff, frontline staff, admin, improvement leads, clinical leads, all sorts of folk in the NHS, but also looking beyond industry and engaging with academics. And to develop a model to try and distill out what are the kind of key factors that are important to sustain change. And just, I mean, I've said here a word on ambulatory emergency care and the acute frailty networks. Those big networks that we talked about at the beginning, that we've had a couple of hundred organisations pass through, undertake the sustainability assessment as part of their membership. And we've got lots of data. There's an absolute correlation between their sustainability scores, so where their strengths and weaknesses are regarding sustainability, and the action they take as part of the planning as they go through their programs of work to improve their weaker kind of aspects. So there's a really strong evidence base for this this model. And I mean, I'll touch on each of these in turn, but there are 3 domains. So there's a domain around staff, so training and involvement, senior leadership, behaviours. There's some organisational things that you would expect around infrastructure and a fit with organisational culture and goals. And then there are some process things. So the adaptability of a process and the credibility of benefits beyond patients, helping patients too, and the kind of monitoring process. This is there's a link at the bottom of this slide which we can send out. So the whole of this tool is available online, and it's detailed, and it kind of it weights different domains based on their importance. So they're not all perceived as equal. Some are more important than others. So you can do this. You can just download it and use the model. So just on the kind of process things that came to light through that dialogue with the NHS, what we're about, there have to be benefits really, ideally, beyond benefits for patients. So, you know, it needs to work for staff, and it needs to, you know, in some way improve or maintain the level of efficiency and productivity. So if it kind of undermines those other aspects, you're unlikely to sustain your change. And also there's an importance, we've talked already about monitoring, but the credibility of evidence. So it needs to be showing the new way of working or the new service needs to be seen to be making a difference. So continuing with that measurement for improvement and demonstrating impact is a kind of really important aspect for sustainability over time. And then a few more process things. So monitoring over time, I've said about communicating. So having a process to continue to share results, send, you know, when you've had some good news stories, being able to promote those and amplify those is a really important aspect. But some functional things like the service or process needs to be able to withstand new internal and external pressures. As we know, in organisations, priorities shift. But a key aspect for sustainability of a new way of working or process is that it can withstand those external pressures. And that's linked in a way to the sort of the people side of things. So if the change is reliant on a single person, then, you know, you're more likely to have problems around sustainability, as we would all predict. Just then a word on staff. We've talked about just the importance of and criticality of having kind of authentic engagement with staff and genuine listening. And the sustainability findings showed that it needs to be an end-to-end process of staff engagement and involvement, from that light bulb ideas generation part of things through to empowering staff, as Piers has said, to take action, to run planned use study cycles, tests of change, through to kind of training as things become more embedded, that kind of the training and education and staff involvement for continuous improvement. And then the other aspect of staff is around leadership. We've talked quite a bit about leadership, but this is borne out in the tool, you know, clearly evidenced around the importance of clinical and senior leadership, both in terms of engagement and support, but leaders who will get involved, who will use their influence to support the ongoing progress and sustainability of a particular service or project, and also remove barriers. So that's linked back to that step 5 of that Piers talked about. So removing barriers and empowering others to act. And then the infrastructure. So this is both about the obvious things that we do around policies, job descriptions, SOPs, and so on, but also the importance of an ongoing fit with the organisational goals and aims. And so if there's a lack of alignment, if it doesn't fit with the sort of strategic goals of the organisation, then there are more challenges around how you sustain. And I mentioned the online tool, which is kind of really comprehensive. I've used those sustainability factors just in project team meetings, and it's a bit of my kind of not so great artwork, but just drawing out a spider chart with those factors sort of laid out, and then asking a team, and it's intuitive, so it's not a science, but just to get teams to think about, where do we think we are in terms of the strength of our clinical leadership? Where do we think we are in terms of benefits? And you can just do, I don't know if you can see the blue line here, but you can get a really nice map of where there are strengths and weaknesses, and this can inform your action planning about, oh yes, we need to do a bit more on training and involvement, or actually we haven't got a very good monitoring system in place. Whilst we've got great clinical leadership, we need to do more with the analysts perhaps to nail down some more measurement. Okay, so I just wanted to share those thoughts on 8. What I'm going to do, because I'm conscious of time, is I'm just going to carry on. I won't stop now for questions, if that's all right. We may have a minute or two at the end, but I'll just proceed. Okay.
Yeah, Lisa, just very quickly,
yeah.
We've agreed that we'll email back those who've answered questions that we've not been able to answer, so that's fine.
Brilliant, thanks Piers, thanks. So now I'm just going to touch on people and the change journey. And I mentioned Bridges earlier around understanding. He's written a really brilliant book called Managing Transitions. And he talks about, and Piers mentioned, assessing people's readiness for restart and the degree of fatigue. And this really fits with this kind of model that Bridges describes. And he says that change and transition are not the same, and describes change as being, it's situational, it's about maybe a new boss, a new site, new team, and so on. But transition is the psychological process people go through to come to terms with new situations. Change is very much an external process, as we know, but transition is internal and kind of invisible, and often not perhaps accounted for in terms of programme planning and delivery in the way that perhaps would be useful. And Bridges has developed, so this is what he calls a model of transition, and it's sort of counterintuitive because rather than beginning with the beginning, it begins with the end. So he says, actually, before you can start a new beginning, you really need to invest the time in looking at managing the ending. And so finding out, what are we losing? What's changed? Who's losing what are we going to have to let go of? And how is that affecting people? So to really understand and honour endings. And invariably, we just jump to, here's our new, we're going to move to this. We've gone through our go, no go gateway. We're going to start, next week or next month, and don't necessarily pay enough attention to just really understanding and managing those endings. And then Bridges says, actually, so there's something about honouring that respectfully. Then he talks about that individuals go into what he describes as a neutral zone. It's where they've got kind of a foot in both camps. So they're still going through a process of letting go, and they're still maybe grieving for what they've, not everybody, of course, some people will be very optimistic and happy about a new beginning, but it's just having sight of that. And Bridges says you really need to be able to support and not carry people, but really understand and support people through that process. Because those two things will provide the best possible platform for a successful new beginning. So I hope that makes sense. And so what Bridges says around managing endings is, expect to see signs of grieving, help everyone to understand why. So that's been a real theme through this whole presentation, is about the rationale, the case for change. Why are we doing it? Why does it matter? That question that somebody raised about what's in it for me is really important. Identify who's losing what, and it might not be the things that we expect. So there are lots of things under the waterline that people may be losing that we might not be sighted on. He talks about marking endings, and is there a way of, you know, it might be, well, whatever the things are, can we mark the ending in a way that's kind of somewhat sort of symbolic and gives gravitas and importance to closure, and then treat the past with respect and let people take a bit of the old way with them. And this might be something physical, it might be you know, or it might be a part of an old process that actually works very well. Can we dovetail that in with a new way of working? But just be open to that. Okay. And so connected with that, I mentioned in that previous slide about expect signs of grieving. This is by Kubler-Ross, and some of you may be familiar with it, but these are the kind of stages that people tend to go through in greater or lesser degrees when they are grieving. And you know, that bit around denial we're familiar with, but this can equally apply to change processes. And so it's quite helpful to have this in your mind's eye if you're leading a project, to think about actually we may get some emotional content from people as we go through this, and actually it's to be expected. And so we need to kind of accept it, and perhaps there might be a tendency for things to become adversarial, particularly if people are angry. It's how we quieten the voices. And so what we suggest here is to think about, as you're leading a project, and it's just to have sight of these stages. So the denial, it won't affect me, it will go away. You know, even if it's a positive thing, I've won the lottery, I'll still do my job. You know, those. So how, if people are in denial, what are your strategies? What are the do's and don'ts? Similarly, if people are angry, how are you going to tackle and understand that rather than quieten it? You know, how are you going to harness it? There may be a lot of wisdom in those voices. There may be some really, really good points. We as leaders may not be right about, you know, some of the things that we're trying to do. So to think about what are the do's and don'ts with teams or individuals who are angry. Similarly, with resistance, you know, ignore at your peril, really. Again, there may be really good grounds, and there can be a sense of disengagement. So what can we do to actively re-engage the workforce that may be resistant? You know, and how are we going to manage that? But what we hope is that people do have a sense of optimism and do begin to re-emerge and think, okay, well, it's going to happen, I need to accept it, maybe I'll explore how I can make the best of it. And that's a really fragile stage, because people can just dip back into resistance and anger if they're not supported and heard and listened to in that at that stage. But what you ultimately hope for is that people re-emerge and sort of kind of emerge and commit to a new way of working. And it's just to you know, resistance should be understood, not overcome. So I guess that was the point I was making earlier about the adversarial nature of things. It's not always helpful. The final slide I want to show is this. This is by somebody called Rogers from the 1950s. And the reason we show this is Rogers looked at the uptake of new farming machinery in the Midwest in the States, and looked at the farming community and how many people were the first in line to take up the new bits of kit, and then who, you know, what was the distribution like of that population. And what he found is quite interesting, in that subsequently there's an evidence base to suggest that this can apply in almost any setting. And so he talks about that those first sort of 2.5% were the innovators, you know, small number, seen by many as mavericks, or you know, working outside of, you know, convention, small percentage. And lots of people won't listen to them because they might think that they're, they're kind of a bit off the wall or wacky. But the early adopters will, and these are a larger percentage, so 13.5% of people who love the innovators, and they'll just adopt stuff from the innovators. They're not innovators themselves, but they like to be the first in line to test new stuff. And then it's a bit like a Mexican wave. You go then through the early majority and the late majority. By the time you get the early majority, wouldn't follow the innovators, but they would follow the early adopters, and they don't like to be left behind. And then the late majority follows suit, because it begins to get very uncomfortable when you've got your majority of people following the new way of working or with the new kit. And then finally, that last percentage are it's an unfortunate term that he's used, but laggards. The 16% of people that absolutely dig their heels in, are resistant, and may not ever change their view. Why we show this at the end is because when we are leading change, we can often focus on that last 16%. We focus on the people who may be perceived as, oh gosh, they're going to dig their heels in, they might cause trouble, they're going to be adversarial, and we may invest a lot of time in them. But the evidence suggests that actually we want to work with the left-hand side of the curve, because if we want momentum, we need to get those innovators and early adopters up and running, because they will help us influence the rest. So that there is my final slide. So Piers and I have hopefully covered Kotter's steps. Oh, we're putting our cameras back on.
Yeah, at the end.
There we are. Oh, I've turned it off again. Sorry, bear with me.
So hopefully everyone's found that really useful. I think actually, Lisa, have you got the slide with our email addresses on there, just in case people have any further questions?
Okay.
And we've agreed that obviously those questions that we didn't cover, Lisa and I will email you back to sort of give you some response and some tips.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And so we'll turn our cameras back off, and then people can see our email addresses.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you. Bye. And there we are. Lisa at nhsselect.org.uk, and the same for Piers. And then we will close. Thank you, everybody.